The Morning Consult is out with an analysis of the news that broke throughout 2021. Polls conducted throughout the year surveyed more than 100,000 registered voters about more than 350 news events. The goal was to analyze the news that resonated across the country. Here are some of the biggest stories. Biden's signing of the COVID relief package, followed by Texas power blackouts caused by winter storms. Derek Chauvin's guilty verdict also tops the list, as well as the deadly condominium collapse that killed dozens in Florida. Other notable mentions included Delta variant news, the Kabul evacuation, and Trump's impeachment over January 6th. Democrats continue to be more tuned in to top news events than Republicans, who report lower news consumption, according to the study. Team Rising is here to weigh in on the biggest stories of the year. Host of the Nomiki Show, Nomiki Konst, and culture editor at The Federalist, Emily Jashinsky, join us to discuss. Welcome to you both.
Morning.
And Emily, what do you think was the biggest story of 2021 that we'll still be talking about a couple years from now?
I think Ryan Grimm on Rising.
There, obviously. Clearly.
So there's that.
Oh.
I was actually surprised at how far up on the list the Surfside condominium collapses. Ryan, I remember when we were covering that, and it certainly was a huge story. I'm surprised that it got as much play as it did, and it might actually get into if many producers and everyone looks at the survey, there has been this sort of long-standing belief that climate stories, and that's really how it was framed, don't play well and don't get a lot of audience attention. And I do wonder if that's shifting, given how that story seems to have really broken through and was covered in a lot of places as a climate story. So that's something, first of all, that's really interesting. But another thing I want to say about the survey in general, some of these stories, like everything at the top of the list, with the exception of the Surfside collapse, is pretty much what you would expect. Like Nord Stream 2 is at the bottom, but everything else is like you would expect these to pretty much be the top story of the year. But I think maybe the biggest bias in media is being in media. It's bigger than a political bias, is being somebody who follows the news for a living and doesn't read the news like an average consumer does. And there are all kinds of average news consumers, but understanding, that people aren't sort of chained to every single breaking development breathlessly on MSNBC and the Russia hoax is like a good reminder that there are top line things that do sort of penetrate the average person's news diet in a way that the sort of every breathless thing on Twitter doesn't.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think the continuing coverage of January 6th is a good example of that too. And I actually think January 6th was a legitimately very big news event and deserved coverage it was merited. It was very bad, but people don't seem to care nearly as much about it. And at the end of the day, okay, if you don't care about it, that's fine. What are the things that people care about that are being undercovered? Nomiki, what was your big story of the year?
January 6th. I mean, I think this is one of those moments, I can't believe I have to say this out loud, and this is illustrated with this media divide, is that there's a frustration, I think, on both sides that Washington is not responding to the crises of society right now, whether it's climate change, whether it's income inequality, the housing crisis, and of course, the pandemic in many ways. But January 6th is an illustration of this. If a bunch of folks who went in there to murder the vice president and possibly harm many other members of Congress cannot react in a timely way and really hold whoever it is accountable. I mean, these hearings are great and they're revealing quite a bit, but at the end of the day, people died and there was a staged coup. And I think if you don't act in this moment, then when are we going to act? And 5 years from now, if we're in a much worse state, we're going to look back at this moment. And I feel like we might be holding some of these lawmakers accountable who just sat there and maybe didn't vote a certain way or didn't push hard enough. I'm very concerned as a progressive. I'm concerned as an American. I think we're in a much deeper state. And I do think it's connected to that Gulfstream report at the bottom of the page. I think, if the media did a better job of connecting the dots between the geopolitical game and what's happening in terms of sowing dissent, we would maybe be in a different situation. But unfortunately, we live in a 24-second news cycle, and people's attention spans can't process that too much.
And Emily, I think the media made maybe a tactical mistake in the coverage of January 6th that was similar to the way that they they made a mistake when it came to Russiagate, because in both instances you have what are utterly massive stories. Like they're huge. Like the January 6th, the Capitol got sacked. Like that happened. We're now seeing all of these text messages that are coming out. That you're seeing Jim Jordan even forwarding on his own suggestion that actually Pence can flip the election on January 6th. Like you're seeing that like this was an extremely serious thing that happened, but because there was so much kind of talk and speculation and hyping of it since January 6th up until now, it in a weird way drained some of the energy out of it. And they did the same thing with Russia. If they had waited until they knew the facts of what happened with Russian interference in the election, what Russia tried to do, what the Trump campaign was willing to do, and reported it all at once, you'd be like, wow, that's a bombshell. This is incredible. But because it was mixed in with 90% hype and nonsense that then gets refuted, it then kind of allows the story to just be dismissed as there was never anything here. But now I don't know if there's a solution to that. It might be just structural, that because of 24/7 cable news, that's what they're going to do. But I don't know. What do you think of that theory?
I think it's completely accurate, and sometimes people ask why I refer to media as corporate media in a lot of cases, not all cases, but I think that's an important example of why, is that they do have a business model in which they have to frame the news, and it does inform their coverage of the news, and I think that's absolutely true. When you're talking about Russia, fantastic example is like, is there a kernel in there that we should actually be concerned about? Yes, and with January 6th, it's way more than a kernel. There's deep reasons to be concerned with what happened on January 6th, but the story becomes, and necessarily so, and that's a key point, the story necessarily becomes how our major organs, our window into public affairs, botched the story. So, in a sense, it feels like time is infinite, but it really isn't. Like, we have to talk about all of these things, and we have to do it within people's attention spans. And so when we have to spend so much time saying, you are missing the story on January 6th, you're missing the story on Russia, these numbers are hyped, this is out of context, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You got this wrong, you got that wrong. People are always going to make mistakes. Journalists are allowed to make mistakes. That's always going to happen. But of this magnitude, it's part of their business model, and it's also part of their ideological sort of insulation. And it has reached a point where people don't have good information on important issues because you sort of necessarily have to spend on the story being botched itself.
There's a great example of this I saw yesterday that I mentioned on the show, but MSNBC's coverage, it was MSNBC, their coverage of Julian Assange, the possibility that he might be, brought into U.S. custody, brought here, and their framing of the story is, but this could give us an insight into things Mueller thought and told, that we confirm aspects of the Mueller report. Like, that is their way to approach this story, which is just total, this horrific, violation of free speech principles, this prosecution of whistleblowing, et cetera. And that's their frame. What will it tell us about the Mueller investigation?
That's amazing. A perfect example. That is a perfect example.
Yeah.
It's also how the internet works.
Go ahead. What?
Well, I think, it's not just cable news anymore. This is what we considered independent media still operate on platforms that, they profit off of outrage. They profit off of, hitting these trending topics. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling mechanism where, okay, maybe the mass public isn't as interested in Assange anymore. So how do we bring in a hook that'll make our audience interested in the story? We still have to deliver the news, but we have to deliver it in a way that people are going to care so that, they share and like and the ratings go up. It happens at the micro level, it happens at the macro level, and I think it's actually extremely dangerous. We're aware of it, but it's extremely dangerous to democracy. And I think it also creates openings for some of the conspiratorial spaces because they don't trust these narratives anymore. So you see Q growing, and of course that leads to a rise in insurrections.
Right. The mainstream media gets a lot of stuff wrong, and then alternative, contrarian media sometimes corrects them rightly, and then also sometimes gets things wrong. So no one should rely exclusively on any one media organ or apparatus or way of thinking. That's my advice for consuming better journalism in the year to come. Thank you both for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Nomiki and Emily.
Here.
Thanks, guys.
And stay with us for more Rising in just a minute.